Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us for the Introduction to Supporting People with a Criminal Record webinar. We are just waiting for a couple more people to log in, so it shouldn't be much more than a couple of minutes, hopefully. So lots of people have signed in, and one of the first things I always say is put some stuff in the chat so that we know that you're here. But also, I'd be very grateful if you can give me an indication whether you can hear and see me okay, if that's all right. So if someone could pop something in the chat to say, yes, I can hear you, yes, I can see you. I also take compliments, I'm fine with that. So hopefully you can all see and hear me. Let's see. Brilliant, there you are, you can all hear and see me, that's good. Okay, that's good. As you can tell, this is a slightly different platform that you're using, Webinar Jam. Webinar Jam is a specific webinar platform that that I used probably right at the very beginning of the first lockdown. So we're talking, what's that, 14, 15 months ago, before anybody had even heard of Zoom or Teams. No one was really using anything. I think House Party was possibly the only one that people were using at the time. But I started to do a lot of online training through webinars, researched into it, and I decided to sign up for Webinar Jam. And that's why in Inside Out Support Wales, we're using this platform as well. Okay. If you can't see or hear me, Chloe, I've just seen your message there. Try refreshing your screen, Control and R, although you won't be able to hear me say that, so put something in the chat there. If you can't see or so that might help, so people can hear us. Hopefully Chloe will be able to get sorted soon. But yeah, we decided to use Webinar Jam. At the time, it had a lot of advantages because it's web-based, so you don't need to download any programs like you do with Zoom. I know that Teams is web-based as well. It has that option. But the training that we do, we've got a couple this week that are being run through Webinar Jam. If you like what we're doing and you want to book our training for your organization, we can run them all through Teams, through Zoom, through Google Hangouts. We haven't tried Skype, might be able to run it through Skype, or we could just run it through Webinar Jam if you wish. We ran a training program yesterday afternoon for Merthyr Tydfil County Borough Council. That was all run through Teams. Similar content to today, but it's a more in-depth training course. So that was pretty good, and the feedback that we've had so far has been excellent. It's just the same training, different delivery. It's a bit like when you do in-person training, and you're used to using one training venue, maybe one classroom, and you're asked to go into another one. So it's a similar kind of thing. So there we go. So hopefully you are all good. I know I was waiting for 23 people to be signed up, and we've got 23 people signed in. That's great. I will move on then to the presentation today. So here we go. So what I would say, this is our introduction to supporting people, supporting adults with a criminal record training course. It's a training course that I started, like I say, probably about 12 months ago. I've run it quite a lot in a lot of different places. And this is the introduction to that training course. So if you like what we're doing today, this is only sort of like an introduction. So it's I wouldn't quite call it a whistle-stop tour, but we will go into greater detail in the full course. And if you like that, if you want to purchase that from Inside Out Support Wales, then I'll be dropping details in later on. If you've got any questions as we go along, drop them in the chat, and I'll answer them as we go along. So that's good. For you. Webinar Jam has got one advantage, I guess, over Teams and Zoom, in that you're sort of, when you participate by default, you're sort of you're in the chat. You can't really sort of jump in and share your mic and share your slides or whatever. So from from the terms of, you know, imparting knowledge, it's quite useful. But when we have teams, it's a little bit more interactive. So hopefully you've all signed up for Introduction to Supporting Adults with a Criminal Record with myself. My name's Jamie. If you don't know me, I'm one of the directors of Inside Out Support Wales. And all our webinars this week have either been delivered by us as the team, as directors, or volunteers, or some of the people that work with us. We're only a small organisation, so we bring in the expertise as and when we need them. So hopefully that will be useful. So what is the webinar about today? Well, as I mentioned, this is an introduction to the full course that we offer through Inside Out Support Wales. The full training course is generally about 2 hours of online delivery. Sometimes it's a bit longer, especially if you've got a chatty group. The council that were with us yesterday were quite a chatty group when we ran the full course for them, so it can go on a little bit longer. That's fine. In the full course, we drop in loads of practical handouts and guides that would be useful, and we're constantly trying to improve and build the capacity of the course all the time. We also have additional sections in the full course all about, for example, the Rehabilitation of Offenders Act and why it's important. We go into greater detail in terms of working out spent dates. We also look at sort of good practice things when it comes to disclosure statements and all kinds of additional stuff. It's a little bit more involved, so hopefully, if you want to join in for one of the full courses, that will be quite useful for you. When you do the full course as well, we also give you a full set of the slides that we use, and we'll give you tons and tons of relevant links. The webinars are automatically recorded by Webinar Jam, and what happens is, what will happen today actually, you'll get a follow-up email a few hours after this is finished, saying thanks you for participating, and it will send you a link so you can view that webinar again in your own time, in case Amazon have turned up with a delivery, or your shopping's arrived, or the postman's arrived, and want you to take a massive parcel in from next door and you miss an important bit. So that's quite useful. But all our webinars are being recorded anyway this week. We're going to be uploading them to YouTube, and we'll be sending out a link for that at a later date. Also, like I mentioned, if you want to do the full course with us, if you want to book it with us, that's great. And I mentioned then we can deliver it on Teams, on Zoom. I nearly said Tombs then. That's a whole different training program. So we can deliver it on Teams, through Zoom, Hangouts, or through Webinar Jam if you wish. One word of warning about Webinar Jam: we're discovering that some local authorities and a couple of universities, Webinar Jam isn't a whitelisted site, so they have a bit of difficulties enrolling. But I know that we had a couple of issues this morning, and I'm just looking at a couple of people that we had this morning that were having a few problems enrolling, have signed up, and we had a bit of jiggery pokery, bit of internet jiggery pokery this morning to get them all signed up. But that's good that everybody is there, so brilliant. Okay, right, on with the show. So I start off when we're talking about people with convictions and supporting people with convictions. I asked this question. I want to know a bit about your knowledge as well. So I've got 2 questions to ask you. That is, what do all the following have in common? But one of those people is the odd one out. I want to know who it is and why. So please put your answer in the chat. Okay. So what do they have in common? Who's the odd one out and why? Please put your answer in the chat. I want to find out. See if you can work out who the odd one is and why. So put your answer in the chat. What do they have in common? Who's the odd one out and why? I'm going to test your knowledge now. This is when people get a bit cagey. They're like, oh, I don't know what to put in there. So let's have a little think. So John has gone straight in. Princess Anne, no criminal record. Martha Stewart. All have criminal records. Pretty much, yeah. We've got a few. We've got a few here that are getting the gist of it. People are saying all have criminal records. That is correct. Ian Tompkins, well done. You win a virtual prize. Well done. A few people are going for Princess Anne. We've had a bit of Martha Stewart. Let's see. Who are we going to get else? All had a brush with the law. I like a good phrase, a brush with the law. Princess Anne, odd one out. All arrested apart from Paul McCartney. Okay. Let's see who we're going to go for. I shall see if we get any more coming in. So a few of you are going for it there. I'm going to put you out of your misery. So a few of you got it right. On the nail. Princess Anne is the odd one out. I sneakily put her in the corner because I thought you might not have spotted them. I thought you just sort of scanned them. So yeah, you are right. The odd one out is Princess Anne. So what do they all have in common? Which I think was alluded to by Ian, which was they all have criminal records. That is correct. They've all got criminal records. The odd one out is Princess Anne. So all those people on the screen have spent time in prison, with the exception of Princess Anne. But Princess Anne has a criminal record. Scandal, royal family. So that's the answer. Okay, so now you're thinking, okay, Jamie, that's easy. Well, what should she get a criminal record for? I'm going to tell you now. I should get my notes. So Princess Anne. In 2002, Princess Anne pleaded guilty to a charge under the Dangerous Dogs Act. One of her dogs, a 3-year-old English bull terrier called Dottie, bit 2 children as they walked in Windsor Great Park. She was charged with her husband, Commodore Tim Lawrence, great title, of being in charge of a dog that was dangerously out of control in a public place. So she was fined £500 for the attack and ordered to pay £250 in compensation and £148 in costs at a magistrate court in Slough. I don't know whether she represented herself, probably not. The penalties available for the events allowed for a fine of up to £5,000, 6 months in jail, and the destruction of the dog. The court heard from the dog psychologist, Dr. Roger Mugford, because of course the royal family would have a dog psychologist. So Dr. Roger Mugford said that the 3-year-old should not be put down. It wasn't, thankfully, all you animal lovers out there. Dr. Roger Mugford also treated some of the Queen's corgis after they bit her. And he said that Dottie was an utterly placid, playful dog. So there we are. So that's an interesting fact there. So you can share that on the dinner table. When dinner parties are allowed, are they allowed now? I don't know. That's a little bit of a trivia that you can introduce that. I do like Aaron's suggestion there of hitting Emlyn Hughes with her handbag on Question of Sport. If you look back on that, Emlyn Hughes was a little bit over familiar, wasn't he, with Princess Anne on Question of Sport back in the day. So there we go. There we are. So there, yeah, Sarah Burke just laughing out loud. Glad you're on mute. Yeah, no problem. So that's it. And the other thing why I put that list up there is because if you look at a lot of the names on there, they're also like quite famous people, and they're also seen in some areas as being role models. So when you look at them in that respect, you know, not all of the names on there are role models, but some of them, you know, people do hold them in high esteem. You know, gosh, one of my personal heroes is Eric Cantona. You know, people look upon them as role models and look upon them for, you know, following their example, whatever. And yet, you know, all the people there have got a criminal conviction, and all of them have been to jail with the exception of Princess Anne. You know, for example, let's look at Anthony Joshua. Anthony Joshua not only is a role model for, you know, for sports people, for young people, he's looked upon in quite high esteem. He's quite candid about the fact that he's had a brush with the law, to use someone's phrase before. So, you know, he's now, you know, heavyweight champion of the world. He conducts himself fantastically professionally. He's clearly got a very good team around him. But he's quite candid. He talks about, yeah, I had a brush with the law. Boxing has been used loads and loads in the past as a really good tool of engagement for working with young people, either who've been in the criminal justice system or maybe as a diversionary program, you know, to keep people from going further into the criminal justice system. So that's why I like to put that list out there. So hopefully that's given you a bit of a flavour there. That's, you know, having a conviction, you know, is probably more widespread than maybe you might think. So now I'm going to ask you a question, and I'm going to do it a little bit differently this time. So I'm going to put a poll in the chat. Okay, so I'm going to put a poll in the chat, and I want to know, how long is a paper DBS check valid for? So you probably didn't know you're going to be doing sort of questions and answers this morning, did you? So how long do you think a paper DBS check is valid for? What do we think? Many of us will have done this in our work. Probably most of us have done things like enhanced checks. So let's see what we're going for. I can see lots of clicks going on. What do we think? Okay, try and pop it in the polls if you can. So Teresa's put down there. So if you can click on the button for the poll, if you can see that. So a lot of people, 90% of us are going for 3 years. 9% so far have gone for 1 day. Got loads and loads of examples. People are getting a bit cagey now. People are sort of hedging their bets. We've had a few more for 1 day, a few more for 1 day, several for 3 years. Someone's put in for 4 years, for 1 year. Yeah, we've got quite a few. Okay, let me publish the results for you. There we are. You should be able to see those results in the chat there. So most people think that a paper DBS check is valid for 3 years. Why do we think that? I think I probably know. It's because wherever we work, generally you do a DBS check when you start there, and then 3 years later, you get a email or you get a phone call from your HR department saying, we need to renew your DBS check. So everyone thinks generally 3 years. Sometimes people have got to do it every year. So an organisation that I freelance with, School of Hard Knocks, they generally drop me an email once a year. Not many organisations do 5 years. And now you're thinking, okay, but a few of us said 1 day. If you said 1 day, congratulations, give yourself a pat on the back, round of applause, you got it right. So technically, a paper DBS check is only valid for the day that is issued. Why is that? Well, that's because you could be convicted of an offence the day after it's issued. So most people don't often think that. And I put that out there to say that most people think that when you want to try and find out about a person's conviction, that a DBS check is the only way that you can go about it. There are other ways, I'm going to come on to that in a moment. But technically, a paper DBS check is only valid for the day that it is issued. So the reason for that is that the government now want people to register online for the disclosure and barring service. It's the update service. So the service updates in real time. So if you're working with someone and they have to get a DBS check, whether it's a basic check, a standard, or an enhanced check, it might be worth thinking about them registering with the update service. I think it's £13 to register. You've got like 40 days from when you do a DBS check, I think, to register with the service. It's £13, and I think it asks you for renewal every 2 years. It's a slightly odd system. Yeah, so as Larry's put down in the chat there, yeah, 2 years perhaps. So every 2 years they do that. It's quite handy doing the update service because if you do a basic check or a standard DBS check or an enhanced check, that check is only allowed to be done on you, generally by an employer, with your consent. If it's done without your consent, then the organisation can both have their ability to do DBS checks withdrawn by the Disclosure and Barring Service, and they're also potentially eligible for a €20 million fine because they're breaching GDPR regulations. And although I said €20 million, that's actually been written into UK law as well as EU law. So I know that we're in a transition period, but technically we are out of Europe now. That's been written into European law. So those organisations are liable potentially for that amount of fine. So if you register with the service, that's a copy of my a couple of screenshots from my system from last year. I can see on the left-hand side there with a big arrow who's checked me out. So I can tell that Axis and Media Academy Cardiff have checked me out. Why is that important? That's important because I gave them my consent to carry out those checks. It also gives you a handy expiry date there, and they also write to you, email you to let you know when you're coming up for a renewal date. So it's quite handy for keeping check of it. So of course, you know, registering with the service then will give you a lot of information. You can register for the service for basic checks and standard and enhanced checks. So that's quite useful too. It's a really handy system if you've got someone maybe who's doing you know, freelance work, or maybe they are doing agency work and they could be working around different places. Even with basic checks, very, very well worth doing. Okay, so I always put that out there. So I've just mentioned one thing there. I want to turn the tables on you now on the chat function, and I want you to tell me about how else you can find out about a person's conviction. So I want you to list the chat function to think about any other ways you can think of to find out about a person's conviction. Okay? So let's see what we've got in there. So what have we got? Let's have a little look. Google, yeah, a lot of people say Google straight away, definitely. You could ask them. What else have we got? Reported in the local news, asking them. Google, Google and ask them. Have a conversation with them. The news, yeah, definitely. We've got lots of different things that you could do there. What else have we got? The probation service. Yeah, if you're with an organisation, I know actually we've got people here from HMPPS working with us, and DWP who have pretty good relationships. So yeah, definitely that's worthwhile thinking about as well. If you've got access to you know, things like the Sex Offenders Register, probation service, Sarah's Law, yeah, it's something worth thinking about there. If you have a sharing agreement, probation or DWP, you can get that information. Some organisations don't. One of the things, I'm happy to be told otherwise here, but if you have, if you know, what I discovered when I was doing this training course face to face, when I talked about, you know, relationships with, for example, HMPPS, probation, DWP, prior to lockdown and the pandemic, people used to say to me that the information that they used to get from those sources wasn't as great as it is now. And it might be because everything has had to go online. So there's a slight tightening up of procedures. So I'd be happy to hear from anybody out there who tells me that actually the communication systems and the referral systems have been improved. We did hear that people said that it wasn't prior, but it seems to have been tightened up a bit now because everyone's working online. So yeah, DVLA's online checks, mappers, sharing agreements. If you've got that in place, that's good. Yeah. Okay. Bear with me a second. I'm just writing something down. Okay. So one of the things is really important that you've talked about on there is actually asking people. If you ask people, you'll get, as Mel's alluded to there, you're going to have a conversation with them. And if you're dealing with someone with a conviction, they will have, you know, maybe one support worker, which will be you. So anything that you can do to build up that level of trust with them and know that you are genuine, and they can help to recognize the fact that, you know, you're there in their best interest, that can be particularly important. When I ran one of these courses once with a local authority, and I won't name them, the very simple thing of asking the person that was sat, you know, either on the other end of the phone or sat in a centre with them, you know, asking them what their convictions were. That hadn't occurred to me. It was all about policies and procedures and forms. But actually, I think about having a conversation is important with people. Why is that important? Because they've probably got one support worker as you, whereas I know that you guys will probably have you know, you're going to have a plethora of individuals who you're supporting at any one time. I know different organisations have got different numbers, so anything that you can do there to build that level of trust is good. Google is often one thing that we hear about. If you don't have those relationships with HMP or DWP, you Google people, okay? I'm going to come to that in a moment. Things like Sarah's Law, Mapper, and what else do we have there? Sex Offenders Register can give you that information as well. But Googling people is something that often that people say, that's what I'm going to do, I'm going to Google people. So that is a particularly interesting technique and tactic. And I've certainly seen organizations and individuals do that, even though they have the information that maybe they need right in front of them. So there are other ways that you can get information on your convictions. So one of the things that you can do is something called the subject access request. And what this means basically is you have the right to ask for a copy of the records the police have about you. Pretty straightforward. If you've got someone who's under 18, they can also apply. But if someone's doing it on their behalf, it has to be done in an official capacity. So it might be a signed letter, an authorization document, or even power of attorney. It can take up to 40 days to get that information back. So I can tell you now, if there's a lot of information to come back, it will take 40 days. If there's not much information that the police are holding about that individual, it'll be a lot quicker. Basically, it'll be back in no time at all. It's now free. It didn't used to be free. I think it was £25 originally, but it is now free. It's a really useful starting point if you're working with someone and you're trying to build up a picture about them. However, it is just a record of the information that the police have about you. It doesn't differentiate between any spent or unspent convictions, so that's a real challenge. But like I say, it's a really useful starting point in terms of building up a picture. Also, from what I've spoken to people about when they've done this themselves, it kind of gives them a little bit of autonomy back, to find out what the police have got about them. So it's almost like, you're causing the police inconvenience, so it can be quite appealing in that way. And basically what it does is it searches for information on the Police National Computer Database via ACRO. Interestingly, I discovered a couple of Christmases ago that my friend's wife, she works on this system, so that was quite interesting to having a chat with her about it. And she said to me, yeah, basically, if there's a lot of information they've got to find out, it will take up to 40 days. But that's one way you can get information on a person's convictions or on your convictions, because you should be doing it in your own capacity. So Google searches, that's what we often hear about. And I can totally understand that. If we want to know anything these days, what do? We Google stuff. My daughter does that. She's only 7. Every time I ask her a question, that she needs to know the answer for, she just goes, straight onto a little Google mini hub and asks a question. So Google search is quite a popular way of finding out information. And the top 10 sites for UK news at the moment online are the BBC, The Guardian, the Daily Mail, the Telegraph, the Independent, the Mirror, the Sun, the Express, the Metro, and Channel 4. Why is it interesting that the Mirror is on there? If you know the answer why it is interesting that the Mirror is on that list, I'd be interested if you could please pop it in the chat. So why is it interesting that the Mirror is on that Google search, is on that list then of the top 10 UK news sites? Why is the Mirror significant? While you're having a think about that, please remember that if a search pulls up some information, it may only give you one side of the case. It might only give you the allegation or the arrest, the juicy stuff, but it might not necessarily give you the court's decision. Regional papers are full of look who's in court type stories, aren't they? They love that. So yeah, that's why it can be on there. Also, I've got a pretty unusual name. My name's Jamie Grundy. So if you search for me, there's a good chance if my name has been associated with a conviction or an arrest or an allegation, if I'm in the news, it's going to come up, isn't it? Pretty easily. But if you've got a name like Sarah Smith, Andrew Wilson, something like that, it's going to be quite interesting there. It's that how do we know that we've got the right person? Even if we look at locally, we try and filter the results by locale. How do we know we've got the right person? We're not always going to get that information correct. So when I asked you why it was interesting that the Mirror is on there, so people talk about it being a gossip paper, they're not online, they maybe preach to us. The reason why the Mirror is interesting in that list is because the Mirror is owned by Reach PLC. Now, Reach PLC are, I think, the largest owner of regional newspapers in the UK. So I'm speaking to you from sunny Cardiff today, and most people here will check out, Wales Online to see what's happening in their news. Wales Online is owned by Reach PLC. I was at a conference last year, I think it was in the East Midlands. I was checking, actually, no, not last year, it would have been 2 years ago now when you could go to conferences. I was checking out the news in the area to see what was happening. When I pulled up the local local news site online, it looked just like Wales Online, lots of red banners, etc. And that's because it was owned by Reach PLC. So Reach PLC have got loads of regional news sites. There's quite often a connection between some of the journalists putting stuff in the regional papers and then that being picked up by the Mirror nationally and it going online there as well. So quite often, if your story is picked up locally by one of the Reach PLC regional news sites, there's a significant chance that it could go national as well. So that's why it is quite interesting. Yeah, Trinity Mirror, actually, as Lorraine has put there, Trinity Mirror, Reach PLC, I think, is the new name for Trinity Mirror. I think they just went with a new name, a bit of new branding. So that's why that's important. Also, look at the names on those lists there for those Google searches. There are, pretty much well-established agendas with all those sites there online. The Daily Mail has a more conservative-leaning slant to its news reporting. Arguably, you could say that it's in line with the Conservative Party. The Conservative Party like to say that they are the party of law and order, so it's all about more police powers, locking up more ex-offenders, that kind of thing. Whereas The Guardian is a little bit more left-leaning, is arguably a bit more liberal, maybe a little bit more Labour in its reporting. And that talks about people giving, doing good in the community, rehabilitating themselves, turning negatives into positives, restorative justice, all that kind of stuff. So when you look at those websites on there, there's very much, you've got to take it with a pinch of salt. There's always an agenda there behind each of those there. There's a couple of other things that I talk about as well when it comes to convictions. Something that has become quite popular in the last few years is something called the right to be forgotten. And this is something which is similar to GDPR, and this is enshrined in both UK and EU laws, so it's Brexit proof. And right to be forgotten basically states that people have the right to have posts removed which were published earlier in their life that could hinder them personally or professionally where it's not in the public interest. So information has to be deemed irrelevant, outdated, and otherwise inappropriate. And ideally, you're trying to strike a balance between privacy and censorship. It's based on two cases, the case law that was established here. Two cases. So one is workplace crime in the UK, which was fraud from the late 90s. And one, which I found quite surprising, was a double murder from 1982 in Germany. I'd love to tell you more about both of those cases, but I can't find any information about them because, of course, those posts have been removed. Okay, so when we're looking up for, when we're trying to find out about people online, there is a chance that some of those posts may have been removed. From experience, from knowing people who've tried to get posts removed online about themselves, there tends to need to be a passage of time that's happened before those posts could be removed. And those posts will be removed if it is judged that they are hindering that person personally or professionally, and where it is no longer in the public interest, if they are considered irrelevant, outdated, or otherwise inappropriate. So I've got a bit more information on right to be forgotten. So this was something from 2018 when a request form was launched by Google, and after this ruling, and it received 12,000 entries from right across Europe within the first 24 hours. At one point, it was receiving 20 requests a minute, and it grew to 41,000 requests in the first 4 days. Feeding into fears about the potential consequences of this ruling, almost a third of the requests were related to accusations of fraud, accusations now I'm talking about, whilst a further 12% were attached to child pornography arrests and 20% for other serious or violent crimes. Of the first 12,000 entries, around 1,500 were said to be from people in the UK, with an ex-politician, a paedophile, and a GP amongst them. Since the following December, in 2018, the number of requests by Google has grown to around 175,000 from all 28 EU countries. And it's a little bit out of date now, but it's basically estimated to be about 65,000 of those links coming from the UK. And as of January last year, so January 2019, Google had complied with 43.3% of the requests to remove them. So if you're talking about 175,000 requests, 65,000 of those coming from the UK, not far off approaching half of those requests have been removed now online. So right to be forgotten, I think, is something which is interesting, and it's something probably going to have a little bit more legs as you go along. How long does it take for the information to be totally removed? So Google say that information, once it's been granted, is removed. I believe that they are given 3 months to have that information removed. I think it's often quicker than that, but I can look into that for you, David. I'm not 100% sure about that one, but the right to be forgotten is something that is of significant interest. I'm fairly certain this has been reported on previously in Inside Time, which is the newspaper which is in all the prisons as well. So I mentioned before about the Rehabilitation of Offenders Act. That's particularly important for us when we're talking about supporting people with convictions. And we're going to come on to a little section in a moment about spent dates. But basically, if you don't know the finer points of it, the Rehabilitation of Offenders Act states that some criminal convictions are allowed to be ignored after a rehabilitation period. Its purpose is that people do not have a lifelong blot on their records because of a relatively minor offence in their past. It's kind of a loaded statement now, but it is their text. So lifelong blot on their records. Lifelong, that's quite significant. Blot kind of implies something which is a little bit less significant. And a relatively minor offence in their past. What might be a relatively minor offence to you might not be a relatively minor offence to myself, and vice versa, especially if you're working with people who have been victims of crime as well. Sometimes even the smallest offences carry effects long into those persons' past. So the rehabilitation period is automatically determined by the sentence. After this period, there has been no further conviction. After this period, if there's been no further conviction, then that conviction is deemed to be spent, and with certain exceptions, don't need to be disclosed by the ex-offender in any context, such as when applying for a job, obtaining insurance, or in civil proceedings. Obtaining insurance is a big deal. I'm going to talk a little bit about this in a while, but our public liability insurance with Inside Out Support Wales costs about 3 times more than we were expecting it to because of the lived experience of one of our directors. And think about it in this way: a conviction for the purposes of the Rehabilitation of Offenders Act includes convictions issued outside GB. Therefore, foreign convictions are eligible to receive the protection under the Rehabilitation of Offenders Act. Okay. It talks about receiving protection. However, basically, normally across mainland Europe, if you've got someone who's got a conviction, that will generally find its way back to the UK. Not always, though. There's an individual that I work with, and I won't mention the name or their organisation, but it's one of the several organisations who I freelance with, and it will be that person has got a conviction that was obtained a couple of years ago in Germany. If it was in this country, it wouldn't be spent, and yet it's not found its way over to the UK. Pretty much that is an exception to the rule, though most of mainland Europe, those offences will find their way back to the UK. Australia, the US as well. If we're talking sort of, Asia and Africa, then they don't always find their way back. Generally, if there's a good extradition, I can't say the word now. Extradite, no, you know what I mean. If there's a good relationship with that country, if we extradite those individuals, I can't remember I can't say the exact word, then generally those convictions will usually find their way back to the UK. What sort of insurance are we talking about? Trish has asked. Basically, all insurance is what I'm finding there. Any insurance that you have to convict. Yeah. Extradition. Thank you very much, Trish. Thank you very much, Teacher's Pet, there for helping me out. I appreciate that. Is the time for spent convictions based on what the sentence was originally for, or on what the person actually served? It's the former, so it's what the conviction is. The sentence is based on the sentence which is handed out at the time, not for how long it was served. And I'm going to come on to that in a moment as well. And Harrod. So I'm going to give you a little quiz now. So you didn't know you're going to be doing maths this morning. I didn't put that in the small print when I asked you to book onto this webinar. Apologies for that, because people may not have signed up, especially someone like myself who took 3 attempts to get their maths GCSE. But we're going to do a little bit about maths now. Okay, I want you to look at this here. So bear with me a minute. So we are going to go through a little chart now, which has got some information on spent dates. Now, if you book on the full course, we go into a lot more detail about working out when convictions are spent. But this is a rough table that I use that gives you a good flavour for working out a person's spent date. Okay. So if you get a fine, whether you're an adult or whether you're under 18, then that fine is spent after a year's time. If you receive a community order, if you're over 18, then it's the length of that order and a year, or it's the length of that order and 6 months if you're under 18. If you're given a prison sentence, and I'll come on to that a bit, picking up what you talked about then and Harrod in the chat. So if you're given a prison sentence which is less than or equal to 6 months, it's the length of that sentence, and then it is plus 2 years if you're an adult, or the length of that sentence and 18 months if you're under 18. However, if you get a prison sentence of over 6 months, and it's less than or equal to 30 months, then that's the length of the sentence and 4 years for adults, or the length of that sentence and 2 years for under 18s. Again, prison over 30 months, less than or all the way up and equal to 4 years, it's the length of that sentence, and 7 years for an adult, or the length of that sentence and 3.5 years for under 18s. But for anyone receiving a prison sentence of over 4 years, currently, if you're an adult or whether you're under 18, it is never spent. So the issue about insurance, as it currently stands, you could have a person who gets a sentence which is over 4 years. They could be, let's say, 18 now. As it currently stands, they could be looking for insurance for a car in the 60s and 70s, and they could still be disclosing it, and they could still be paying higher premiums. So that's quite significant, okay? So I mentioned we're going to do some maths. It's easy maths. It shouldn't be too difficult. Please pop your answers in the chat. So at the bottom of the chart now, I've got a little bit of maths for you, okay? Think about this. So Farhad, he's 23. He gets convicted of robbery in October 2008, and he's sentenced to a year in prison. When will his conviction be spent? When do we think? Let's see if we can pop that in the chat there. What do we think? So if you know what the answer is, feel free to pop it in the chat. There's a lot of maths going on. I can almost hear the brains ticking from this side of the screen. So what do we think? 5 years someone's put. What do we think? Okay, let's have a look, see what we've got. October 2013, people are going for. October 2013, October 2012, 2013, 4 years. Oh, Chloe's spelling it out for everybody. Well done, Chloe. Excellent. Top of the class for Chloe. They're working it out. Okay, 4 years, October 2012. Susan's asking what type of robbery. I don't know. I didn't read his case notes. I'm looking at the sentence. Shall I put you out of your misery? Because a lot of us are getting it right there. Well done. So the answer is October 2013. So a lot of you got it right. So if you said October 2013, well done. Round of applause. Pat on the back. Virtual gold star coming down. Well done. So why is that? Well, prison was over 6 months. Therefore, that's the length of that person's sentence plus 4 years is over 18. So essentially 5 years, I think a few of you put down on there. Now, that's just one isolated example. It can be quite difficult to try and work out, can't it? And it's very easy to get it wrong. From experience of working with individuals who've got convictions, helping them work out their spent dates, with some exceptions, they don't always know when it is. And in fact, some people that I've worked with, particularly for some of the organisations who I freelance with, that are sort of on the fringe of the criminal justice system, their convictions, they think that's it, the die has been cast, I've got a conviction, I've got to disclose it all the time, you know, that's it, it's going to be hanging around my neck like a millstone. And that's not always the case. With some of those individuals, I've been able to sit down, help them work out when their spent date's out. And in quite a few cases, I've been able to say, do you know you no longer need to disclose this conviction for the jobs that they're going for? So that is why it is particularly important. Now, I mentioned in the what do you call it? I mentioned in the sort of preamble earlier on that when we do this as a full course, we go into greater detail about this, and I'll give you some additional resources. It's quite useful, but I just wanted to show it on there. So if you're interested in going into this in greater detail, then the full course that we run gives a lot more information about that. But hopefully that will give you a bit of a flavour for even just using that chart. You know, you can give you a good idea of how you can find out that information and support someone to help them work out when their spent date might be. But I do know from experience as well, if you've got people who've been released from prison, you know, they've got a whole host of things that they're trying to sort out when they're coming out. So sometimes knowing and understanding when their spent date is might not be something that they remember. They're trying to sort out their housing, sort out the universal credit. Maybe they're getting, you know, they're trying to sort out treatment for a mental health condition or, you know, substance misuse issues. And then maybe they're trying to rebuild and repair connections to families. So that's quite interesting when they find that there. This session is going to be, it's not going to be the full hours today, Dave, but we generally block out 2 hours just in case people want to stay on and have a little chat with me afterwards. So just seeing your course on there. The full session is 2 hours. It can be a little bit longer, but don't worry about that. That's okay. Okay, next slide. So just picking up what who said in the chat, and Harrod said, so what about if you're released early? Okay, if you're released early, people often think, I'm out of prison, that's great. Maybe your sentence is not sort of commuted, but maybe, you know, you've been able to be released early on license. Technically, you're still in prison. So if you break the terms of your license, you could end up going back into prison on a recall. I think about this as well. Prison also includes suspended prison sentences, time in a YOI, that's a Youth Offenders Institute, detention, training orders, and other youth custody as well. Remember that life sentences and public protection sentences can never be unspent. Also think about this, multiple convictions and something called drag through. So if you've got someone with several convictions, none of them are spent until the longest one is spent. So remember that, okay? So if you've got someone with several maybe minor convictions and one slightly longer conviction, none of them is spent until the longest one is spent. So that's quite significant. Okay. Okay, so one of the things I talk about here is about good practice. And I'm all for good practice. Good practice is basically the foundation of what a lot of our Inside Out Support Rails work is based on. We try and take good practice not only from within the criminal justice system, but also from examples around it and examples which are relevant. But I'm going to share a couple of examples of good practice now. And I'm going to share with you a little film. I've got some funky films here. I'm going to share with you an individual now who is employed up in the Northwest, and she's going to talk about her experience. So I'm going to share with you this little video.
I grew up with mum and dad, brother, everything going on normally, and then my dad went to a football match one day, 15th of April 1989, and unfortunately it was one of the 96 who didn't come home, and that changed everything for me that day.
That's the Hillsborough disaster that she's talking about.
I started mixing with the wrong kinds of people and getting involved with drinking and taking drugs, which helped me forget things that were going on, in my head and what had happened, you know, to my dad, because we'd never really had any answers at that point. I was then arrested for drink driving for the first time, was given a community order, and then went back to my normal life. I found myself as a single parent. Again, my drinking increased, and again led me into, you know, another path of destruction. I was arrested again, did 6 weeks in Style prison, and I came home and fell back into the old routine. I was again arrested. This time I had the kids in the car with me, so it was taken a lot more seriously. Fortunately, they put me on what was called an IAC programme, the intensive alternative to custody. You've got to do something every single day of the week. So I was doing unpaid work twice a week, supervision twice a week. I was enrolled in education, training and employment. I had to attend alcohol programmes as well, so I was kept busy all week. And that got me back into a routine as well, and by that point I wasn't drinking at all. I thought, this is my opportunity now to focus on me and to get myself right and do what's right for me and my family. My probation officer at the time spoke about taking my case back to court and having it revoked for good progress, and then I'd become a volunteer for the probation service. I could achieve something in my life if I really stuck to this, so I started volunteering and never really looked back from there, to be honest. When I found out I had the job, it was just an amazing feeling, and I've thrown myself into it ever since.
Lindsay had just such a way with our service users. She could reach them in a way that I wasn't able to reach them, and that's because of the experience she'd had. She was one of them, but different. She'd moved on from that, and I think that was really significant.
Being on probation, being part of the community rehabilitation company gives you access to services in the community. We can put referrals in straight away and get people onto programmes and get them working with services that will help.
The fact that Lindsay has committed her career now to supporting other people and is able to use her lived experience to say to people in their darkest moments, there is a way through this, this was my life, this is what my life is now, makes her a really valuable asset to us, and I'm sure that the people that she's working with and supporting day in, day out really appreciate that.
I think the Interserve Opportunities for All campaign is going to be really beneficial because it's letting people see that people can change. I lost my way, and thankfully I managed to find it back.
So that's a bit, I know it's a little bit of an advert for Interserve, but I think the message that you get from that particular video is quite important. And I really like that little film because quite often, certainly where I work in Wales, it's always, you're often hearing about male ex-offenders, male prisoners, but actually I think it just shows that, it can happen to anyone. Lindsay, they're talking about her experience and the kind of, I wouldn't quite call them, maybe it is the mitigating factors, but the circumstances that led up to, her, offending behaviour, but then also what she did to engage with those systems prior to release is particularly important. One of the other webinars that we ran, I think it was on Monday night, talking about successfully transitioning into the community. That was one of the things that came out of that. Engage with the services that are in prison prior to release. And also it was one of the things that was mentioned last night, actually, when we did the housing one. Was it last night? I can't remember. They're all blaring into one. But when we did one about housing, it was all about, engage with the rehabilitation programs, and particularly housing whilst you're still inside, and it makes that transition into successful life into the community afterwards a little bit more seamless for you, as much as it can be. Also there, I think Lindsay talks about some of those skills that she's got, that skill set, and that's alluded to then by the lady that talks about how she's able to identify with some of their client base that they're working with. She's able to talk to them in a way that they don't have, with some of the other staff members. So she's got a really important skill set. I controversially run another webinar that's a bit of a plug for it now if you're interested. We've got one later on this week, which is all about why employ ex-offenders. And I controversially talk about, if you've got convictions, maybe that marks you out as a better candidate than others for going for work. I'll keep my powder dry on that one, because the meat of that particular meal is in that other webinar. But if that sounds like it's something that might be of interest to you, please book on to that webinar. That's taking place. I think it is, let's have a quick look on my list. That's taking place, why employ ex-offenders, that's taking place tomorrow afternoon between 1 and 3. You'll get the emails to book onto that. It's a little bit controversial. It's a little bit sort of, putting a controversial subject out there and seeing what people think and then discuss. But I think there's merit in thinking about it, and I'll talk about that more particularly in that specific webinar. But the reason why I talk about good practice is not only Lindsay's example. I want to talk to you about how you should be disclosing convictions on there. So think about it really in this way. Every recruitment process is different. So you have to look at the recruitment process that you are going through when it comes to the job that you're looking at and applying for. That's particularly important, okay? And when you think about it in that way, start looking at maybe how you're going to disclose. So generally job applications where there's a form fall into two camps. One shows that a check will be carried out. So they should be asking you to disclose convictions prior to the interview. Other one is about tick boxes and waiting for interview. So people will tick a box, or they should be ticking a box to say that they've got a conviction and they're waiting for the interview. However, talking about that specifically, what we find is that people will tick that box to say that they don't have convictions and then wait to the interview and then say, by the way, on my application form it said that I don't have a conviction. Actually, I do, and they hope to explain it then. Employment's pretty competitive. It was competitive before the coronavirus and the pandemic. If you tick a box to say that you don't have a conviction and then you do, and you talk about it in the interview, arguably you're giving that individual that's interviewing you a cast iron reason why they shouldn't employ you, because you've just shown there how you are untrustworthy. You've lied to a potential employer. So if they want to find a reason why not to employ you, you've just given them a reason then. There are other ways that you can apply, CVs and covering letters, of course, and they give you an opportunity to sell the best version of yourself, which is why that is important. Again, we go into greater detail of this in the full course, but it's not normally the place where disclosure takes place. I think you should list qualifications and experience gained while inside. Prisons don't work without prisoners, and that's not because there's no one to lock up. That means that prisoners are working as cleaners, they're working in the canteen, they're working in resettlement, they're working in education, they're manning the library, they're gym orderlies, all kinds of stuff. And all that experience is valuable and can show a potential employer that you should be employed. But CVs and covering letters present the best version of yourself. That's not normally the place where disclosure takes place. Now, I want to ask this back to you in the chat. What does an employer want to know, you think, if they're going to employ someone with a conviction? What do you think an employer would want to know if they're going to employ someone who has a conviction? Let's see what we've got in there. If you want to put an answer down in the chat, I'd be much obliged. What do we think? What would an employer want to know if they're going to employ someone with a conviction? If you want to pop your suggestions down in the chat, please. Are they sorry for what they've done? Yeah. What are there changes that they've made in their life? Yeah. How long ago it was? Let's have a look. Let's see what else we've got coming in there. How long the conviction was? Yeah. The nature of the conviction. Yeah. Definitely very important. The specific events, the offence, why, and have you learnt from it what the conviction was? Yeah. Yeah, I think that's interesting what you've put down there, Chloe, in the chat there. What if people are applying for jobs where they don't have to disclose? Should they still list work experience from prison? That's a really interesting one. I think you probably have to look at the job, why that might be. If it's a lived experience organisation, then that experience is still going to be valid. I think it depends how they portray it. And what I will be doing is I will be doing some research into that particular company. I'll be looking at their annual reports. I'll be looking at their website. Are they an organisation that has a really strong social justice ethos to what they do? And maybe that's why they're not asking. And then I think if you can put that down, then you're not going to get a fair crack of the whip. What the conviction was for, can they do the job? Yeah. Time and effort since to rehabilitate themselves. Loads of stuff. You've got loads and loads of good stuff on that one. Okay. That's fair enough what you put down there. Yeah, about construction. Sometimes they're a bit cash in hand, those kind of jobs. From experience, construction companies, Chloe, tend to be made up, not always made up of individuals, but they're generally people who've lived, who've experienced and seen a colourful side of life, and they're generally a bit more, I'll give you a fair crack of the whip. Let's give you a couple of weeks' work and see how it works out. If you can do the job, then they're generally happy. Okay. Whether they have any restrictions, so loads of good stuff on there. So generally, an employer wants to know these things as we've got on screen. They're going to know, what can you tell me about your criminal record? Okay. Can you tell me why did you commit the offence? So I think we've got a couple of people who put on there. What was happening in your life at the time? So who was it you talked about context? The circumstance, I think Aaron talked about there. So what was happening in your life at the time? Obvious one there. If you've got convictions for theft, did you have a drug addiction, and were you stealing to fund that addiction there? Totally understand that. How can I be sure you're not a risk? Risk is an interesting one, because don't always think about risk to the staff or maybe the product. So if you've got a conviction for theft, are you going to steal from that company? Think about the reputational risk to that organisation as well. That's a particularly interesting one. So I used to work for Cardiff Met. Now, Cardiff Met, we did a lot of good work in terms of working in prisons, and we did a lot of good work with, getting people who had convictions whilst they're still a serving prisoner into the university on licence. They studied just like any regular undergraduate or postgraduate would do, except they had their own unique halls of residence. And of course, they had some licence restrictions, but they were easy to work around. I wanted to sing from the rooftops about that. The university didn't want me to do that because they were worried about the reputational risk that they may suffer. So they were worried that, students would be sat at home deciding which university to come to. They may have read an article that I could have put up online about how Cardiff Met takes serving prisoners as undergraduates into the university, and they would be worried about the fallout from that. Would it affect their student recruitment numbers? Student recruitment is quite a competitive area. Other organisations are less concerned about those sort of things. Sometimes it's their USP. It's a unique selling point, talking about marketing there. Timpsons is an obvious example about that. They regularly talk about and give talks. Sir John Timpson talks about, particularly about how they recruit people straight out of prison. So risk is a big issue there, and it's about looking at risk in different ways. And I think if you think about the reputational risk, then sometimes you'll be able to see it from the business organisation's perspective. They're going to know what steps you've taken to change your ways. How is your life different now? That's what it ultimately comes down to. They don't want to recruit the person who's reported maybe in the press 5 years ago, leaping out of the first floor window because the police have banged their door down doing a dawn early raid and arrested that person in possession of Class A substances. They don't want to arrest that person. They don't want to employ that person. They want to employ the person who has learned from that mistake, has educated themselves since that period, has gone on all kinds of rehabilitation programs, who's rebuilt connections to their family, has now got a stable life, and is now committed and looking forward. That's the person that they want to employ, not that person who actually committed the crime. They want to see that rehabilitation journey there, and that's the person that they want to employ. In terms of how you disclose, that often comes from the person that you're faced with, the employer, the volunteering, or the educational opportunity. In brief, you should try and tell the organisation the way that you feel the most comfortable with, whether that is you've got a written down disclosure statement, or whether it's sitting down with a person and talking to them face to face, because it's your experience, it's ingrained in there, and you can talk about your experience. It's always recommended to provide brief factual details of the conviction, evidence it in writing, just like you would do with a CV, and keep your own copy so that you know exactly what you've said to that person. You should always use, I'd argue, to use a proper disclosure statement as a guide, or to submit to an employer. When we go into bigger and greater detail and provide some examples on the full course here. But definitely having a disclosure statement is always useful. If you write one down, at least it's always in your head then, and you can you can use that as a guide or as something that you can read out or something that you can hand to someone. So that is why it's important. There are positive organisations that will give you a fair crack of the whip. So some of the ban the box employers from Business in the Community, BITC, they list over 40 employers, and some of those employers are Boots, Virgin, Barclays, Eversheds, the Civil Service, and more, who are all committed to removing the tick box asking about convictions unless it is essential for the role that you are applying for. The government have a campaign called See Potential, so you can look at that as well. There's also organisations who value the lived experience of people who've been through the criminal justice system. So that down here in Wales, GDAS is the Gwent Drug and Alcohol Service, St Giles Trust, the Woolwich, the Salvation Army, Inside Out Support Wales, that also adds to that list as well. Although I've put down School of Hard Knocks Cymru, because we're a Wales organisation, if you look at School of Hard Knocks, they engage with a number of like housing and construction organisations, and I think, as I mentioned then, a lot of those construction companies, will generally give people a fair crack of the whip. They'll want to know about a conviction up front. They'll tell you there and then if it's going to be a barrier to employment, and they'll say, okay, well, we employ people who've had similar backgrounds to yourself. We'll give you a fair crack of the whip and see how you get on. They're generally going to be more bothered about whether you can do the job rather than what's happened in the past. If you're thinking about education, there's an Unlocking Students from Conviction campaign from Unlock, who are a charity which support people with convictions. If you look at some of those institutions that are listed there, Prisoners Education Trust, a PET, they support distance learning in prison. Cardiff Uni, the University of the West of England, Goldsmiths College and University, they all support the Students with Conviction campaign. And if you're looking at self-employment, anyone who lives in Wales, give us a shout, and we'll always support people who want to go self-employed and trying to access further and higher education as well. We take people on a case-by-case basis. So if you have a conviction, and maybe there's some license restrictions because of the severity of the offence, speak to us. We'll try and work with you on those. Okay, so that's a list of some positive organisations for you. So I talked about convictions as a USP and that rehabilitative journey, and Lindsay's video was an example of that before. But I'm going to give you another example which is quite close to home for us. And this is my colleague Chris from Inside Out Support Wales, and he's given us his permission to use this slide, which is very good of him. And if you look at that picture on the screen there, you will see on the left-hand side, that's his mugshot when he was arrested in 2014. And he was sentenced to 7.5 years for conspiracy to supply Class A drugs. What do we know about that length of sentence, 7.5 years? It's always going to be unspent. Fast forward to 2019, and that's a picture of him at our launch, looking very dapper there in his suit. He's now a director of a social enterprise. He's a project worker for a social care company. I think it's Pobble. He's also a second-year psychology student. He's also a Longford Trust scholar. So the Longford Trust is an organisation who support people who've come through prison and are going into higher education. And they have, not only will they give people small financial awards so they can afford things like laptops or maybe some additional support that they need, but also they will assign you a mentor to help you with your employment post-release. He's also a Hardman Trust winner. Hardman Trust, if you don't know who they are, I've just knocked a book on the floor, apologies for the noise. Hardman Trust produce an annual directory of services, all designed with loads and loads of pages. And they also have a directory of, an annual guide for prisoners and ex-offenders seeking funding support for personal development and resettlement purposes. There's one of these in every prison. If you Google them, the Hardman Trust, you'll also be able to see their stuff online. He got a small financial award from them as well. So, if you're an employer, you're going to employ the person on the right-hand side. Chris has got tons of stuff, and he brings a heck of a lot to our organisation. We've all got certain skills, but Chris is fantastic in terms of being able to really understand what a lot of our referrals are going through, and he supports our people's transition into employment. So the lived experience is particularly important, I think, because when you look at those individuals, and they really improve those organisations, and they make their experience, especially of the criminal justice system, that foundation of their journey going forward. It's a little bit like giving back. Not only do they bring that experience, they bring that authenticity, they bring a voice, and they bring a passion to their particular path. That was evident last night. We had a webinar that we ran on going self-employed, and we had a couple of individuals who talked about their experience of going self-employed straight out of prison, and their passion for what they're doing is huge. It's really, really good. And not only that, they recognize that they have this period of time when they were locked up. It's almost kind of like, popping the cork in a bottle of champagne. They are like fizzing with energy to get going now, just as Chris is a lot of the time. And ultimately, that's what they do. They bring that added dimension to any intervention or any particular program. And that's why it's particularly important. So I'm going to share with you a final film now, before I'm going to be happy to take questions. And the questions are done generally in the chat. So I'm going to share with you a little video now of an individual who I think is a really interesting person about their experiences and what they've done since release. So I'm going to introduce you, if I can find the film now, to a gentleman called Bobby Kasanga, or Robert Kasanga. So hopefully you'll like this film as much as I do.
Sit yourselves up, sit yourselves up.
Guys, everyone please. Hello. Guys, I want you all to close your eyes. Close your eyes. Your eyes are not closed. Make sure you close it, Jason. Ed, close your eyes. And think about 5 years from now, 10 years from now, what is it you want to achieve? What is it you want to be? I want to let you guys know you can do it, because I'm living testament to that. 4 years ago, I was released from prison, but I'm going to take you back to my childhood to let you know why I ended up there. Right? I was a talented footballer. I represented the county. Football was my dream, it was my ambition, it was my passion. So how did that dream turn into despair? It was because of following the wrong crowds. I followed my older brother's footsteps because he had joined the gangs, and I thought he was cool. Ended up spending 8 years of my life in prison, wasted my career. Had dreams, it was all about football. I used football as a catalyst because I saw football was the main thing keeping people out of trouble. So when I was released from prison, I said I'm going to give back to my community for the past mistakes that I had created, and I wanted to form a community organisation that would give an example to the youth of today, and those youths are you guys.
2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9,
I started Hackney Wick Football Club 4 years ago. By the second month, we had a men's team, we had a women's team, and within a year, we had our youth academy. Football has the power to unite people. The club wouldn't be anything without any of you guys, any of the volunteers. People like Pete, the Wicker Man, our biggest fan.
If you come over here on a Sunday, you see all of the youth teams, all from top to bottom, everyone's playing. And it's great. It's everyone's getting involved, everyone's kids are getting involved.
People like Kelly, who volunteers every single week.
It makes me feel good to see these kids participate and see that they're going places.
Or Jaden, who coached the women's team and scored our first ever FA Cup goal last year. People like Bianca, who's come here with ambitions to play at a higher club, and now she's at Tottenham.
There's boys that were involved in crime that are now turned completely away from it. Girls as well. So just having one or two people to influence you well, it's done amazing things for kids, for me, for my son. He plays for the football club now.
You can achieve whatever you want to achieve if you think outside the blocks. I want you to think bigger than your estates. Think bigger than your friends. Think bigger than society's expectation of you. So on 3, I want all of you guys to say, think outside the blocks. 1, 2, 3.
Think outside the blocks.
Get louder. I am a Wicker. There you go, guys. Four years ago, I was sitting in my cell, thinking about what I'm going to do in my life when I get out of jail. And now look.
So I love that film. I think it's a really, really powerful film. So hopefully you'll like it as much as I do. And I really think it sums up a lot of those things that I put down on that slide there about how you can use that lived experience aspect. Bobby Kasanga's he's a real colourful guy, as you can tell. And what I like about that as well is you get a real flavour for him, and you get a real flavour for Hackney Wick Football Club. If you are on Instagram particularly, I'd advise you follow him, because he posts some great stuff on there. And especially that, think outside the blocks is great. He's at Robert Kasanga on Instagram if you follow that, if you use Instagram. So that's everything from me. I shall just to the next slide. So just a bit of a thank you really for joining us today. I hope this has been really useful for you. Before you go, I'm just going to drop a couple of I'm going to drop a couple of things into the chat, so you should be able to download a couple of things at the moment. I've got a little flyer for us in Inside Out Support Wales, so you know a little bit more about us and what we do. And also, I've just sharing with you a document which gives you a bit more information on this full course. If you're interested in booking the full sort of webinar for you, because this is just a bit of a whistle-stop introduction to the full course, is £300 for a 2-hour webinar. And we don't have any sort of maximum limit on it. Well, we do. Our license only allows up to 500, but I'm sure we're not going to be getting 500 odd people signing up. But I hope that's been useful for you today, and giving you a bit more of a flavour of some of our work, not only in Inside Out Support Wales, but also a little sort of dip into the toe of how some of the things that are out there can help in terms of supporting adults with a criminal record. And like I say, if you want us to, run any training courses for you, then feel free. We'll be sending a lot of stuff out after this week in terms of evaluation forms and various bits and pieces. But just a quick thing just to say thank you very much today for joining us. I hope it's been really good. What I will do is I will be on the chat here for about another 10 or 15 minutes. So if you want to drop me a message on the chat, that's fine. Or at my email address, which I know you've all had before, is I will put in the chat as well. Feel free to there if you need to get a hold of me at all any time. But thank you very much for joining us this morning. I hope you're joining us on some of the future webinars. And if you just go to insideout.wales, look for the webinar tab there, and you'll see the rest of them. The rest of this week, what have we got left? We have got, so today we've got one on entrepreneurship with David from Entrepreneurs Unlocked, who we are working with at the moment. He's going to be talking about how entrepreneurship can reduce reoffending. That's 1 till 3 today. Then this evening, 7 o'clock, we've got personal budgeting with Steve, who's one of our team. Then tomorrow morning, we have got reclaiming your personal brand online with myself and Molly, who's going to be working with us soon, handling our social media stuff. You're super duper good. And then we've also got tomorrow afternoon, we've got why employ ex-offenders. That one is also on Webinar Jam, so that'll be an interesting one. And then finally, on Friday morning, we have got from 10 till 12, or from 10 a.m., we've got effective disclosure, how you can really improve that aspect in terms of disclosure, how you can work with people and really make the best version of disclosure that you possibly can, which will improve your chances of employment and also maybe getting into a volunteering or an educational opportunity. So I hope that has been really useful. So thank you very much, everybody. And I will stay online here for another 15 minutes. So if you want to have a little chat on there, thank you for your lovely messages on the chat, which is very nice. You'll also be getting an email fairly soon to be able to watch this again. So I hope that's useful. So Diolch yn fawr, as they say down here in Wales. I've learned a little bit of the language in my 25 years living in Wales. Look forward to seeing you on some of the other webinars. And like I say, if you want to have a little chat, pop stuff in the chat, and I can we can have a little conflab, as they say in Glow Up, over the chat. So thank you very much. I look forward to seeing you on the rest of our webinars. Thank you.